Hi, welcome to History Doodles. My name is Mitch. Today we're going to be talking about a king named Ashurbanipal, who was the king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. It's not as maybe publicized as some of the other ancient empires like the Egyptians and the Greeks, Macedonians, that kind of thing. So I'm going to be going over some background about the empire, Ashurbanipal's world that he lived in, and hopefully give you a good explanation of his life and rule. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right. So, to set the stage, the story begins with a people called the Assyrians. Assyrians are an ethnic group that settled in lands in Mesopotamia well over 1,000 years before when our story is going to take place with King Ashurbanipal. In relation to us, the Assyrians lived 2,600 years ago, in the 7th century BCE. The world that he knew was a lot older than that too, so his religion, his culture, everything he knew about was another 1,500 years older than that. So another way of thinking about that is that his religion and culture was as old to him as the Catholic Church is to us. So it's a very old world, even by the point that we get there. And at this point in time, the Assyrians had, assembled this historically fearsome army, and they were absolutely fucking rolling. They assembled the largest standing military force that the Middle East had witnessed until this time. And they used this military to invade their neighbors and conquer more territory of the known world than any empire had before it. And what made their military so special was their tactics and their combined arms, and then the sheer number of their infantry. And additionally, their entire military was equipped with iron weapons for the first time ever, instead of bronze, which was used before that. Also importantly, they were renowned for their brutality. Being on the other end of the Assyrians was a fate that you wouldn't want. It's so brutal that it's hard for the modern mind to comprehend in some circumstances. So we'll go over some of that in this episode. So if you're a little squeamish about the terrible things people are capable of doing with each other, I wouldn't keep going. But anyway, this brutality that I'm describing must be contextualized in the world around them. So life 2,600 years ago was much more violent in general. The Assyrians were not the only thing that the average person living in Mesopotamia had to worry about. So another thing, for example, was that their lands bumped up into this place called the Eurasian steppe, which takes up 7% of the land on Earth. It's a big, vast swath of featureless steppe land. Think of if you're an American, think of North Dakota, basically. And it was inhabited by nomadic horse tribes called the Scythians, the Cimmerians, and others. And the Assyrians kind of grouped all these people together and called them the Umanmanda. They thought of these barbarian nomadic horse tribes as something less than human, inhuman, half human, something like that. Their life was completely full of conflict, and fighting them was an insane logistical challenge. This aside, the Assyrian military's brutality I'm about to describe in this episode must be understood in a world in which, at this time, if you were living in a village in Mesopotamia, you had the possibility of a tribe of men who you thought were half human, showed up all of a sudden and stole everything you owned, burned your house to the ground, and would do unspeakable things to your neighbors. And then they'd leave, and then you have no idea when they're coming back. You have no recourse to go after them. If I lived in that kind of a world, I might be kind of a dick too. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon, the father of Ashurbanipal, had to deal with that problem and a lot more. In 679, we're told that the Cimmerians broke through into the empire and just went on a rampage and started, doing the things that these people did: raiding, looting, murdering. And Esarhaddon was able to personally lead his army to Cilicia and drive them back out. Another thing that popped up during Esarhaddon's reign was a rebellious populace, which the Assyrians had to contend with pretty much after they started expanding the empire, because the people living in these conquered lands were having a pretty tough go of it. Understandably, they didn't like being ruled by the Assyrians. And now, by this point in time, the Assyrians controlled all the territory in the east to Babylon, all the way to the west to the Mediterranean Sea and the Levant, down even to the Nile in North Africa. And these peoples didn't love having the Assyrian government run things and would start frequently trying to do some sort of violent overthrows. One way the Assyrians kind of mitigated these incidents was one of their timeless tactics called forced migrations. In plain terms, that meant telling the citizens of a newly acquired land to pack their things and move to a completely foreign place elsewhere within the empire. If you were one of these people, you had to just, you might not have even heard of this land, but you and hopefully your family would be forced to migrate to this new place and learn the language and culture of this completely new and foreign area, and do whatever the Assyrian government told you needed to do. The hope here was that, having people scattered out throughout the lands in places they weren't familiar with would make it harder for them to organize and overthrow the government. By 672, Esarhaddon was in his 40s. He started needing to plan for his succession. He had many sons to choose from, and traditionally the role of crown prince was given to the eldest. In this instance, however, he did not go with his first son, who was named Shamash-shum-ukin, but his fourth eldest son, Ashurbanipal. An elaborate ceremony was held to confirm Ashurbanipal, and as the consolation prize to Shamash-shum-ukin, he was given the crown prince of Babylonia. The thought was that this would be an olive branch that would allow the brothers to remain peaceful and not fight in the future. Anyway, Esarhaddon aged, and in his 40s he started to show signs of depression and paranoia, and it led to some behavior to the modern reader like myself seems absolutely insane. For example, in 671, on July 2nd, there was a total lunar eclipse. To the Assyrians, this was an omen that the king was about to die. So Esarhaddon got his advisors together, and he performed what's called a substitute king ritual. And so that I don't miss any of the details, the historian Eckhart Fromm describes this ritual saying, "The solution was to put someone else, usually a prisoner of war, a simpleton, or some other outsider without connection to the royal family, on the throne, to formally assume the role of king. He would be wined and dined and provided with a virgin, who would serve as his queen. But after 100 days at the most, he would go to his fate, a euphemism hiding the fact that the substitute king was killed to absorb the evil that would otherwise have befallen the actual monarch." So in plain terms, Esarhaddon got some poor useful idiot to pretend to be him, so that the forces behind the eclipse would kill this person instead of him. And then, because he might have been a little impatient, since the schlub didn't die right away, he just murdered the substitute king instead, so that he could come out of hiding and be king again. And then finally, in 669, Esarhaddon fell ill while on campaign in Egypt, shortly after he died, which triggered the ascension of the last great Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, and it left him the tough task of stabilizing the empire. Luckily for Ashurbanipal, he had been preparing for the role for at least a few years. Once he was named crown prince, he had a few years to train and learn how to be king, and mold himself into the kind of king he aspired to be. Ashurbanipal revealed himself to be an ambitious young man, with plans to rule as a philosopher king. He idolized legendary Sumerian king Gilgamesh, and he wanted to be a top-flight intellectual as well as a feared warrior. And importantly, he was literate. He might have actually been the first literate Assyrian king. And a lot that we know about Ashurbanipal comes from his own autobiographical inscriptions. In one passage, he writes about his own aims, saying, "I can resolve complicated divisions and multiplications that do not have an easy solution. I read cunningly texts in obscure Sumerian and Akkadian that are difficult to interpret. I have carefully examined cuneiform signs on stones dating back from before the flood, whose meaning is sealed, inaccessible, and confusing." And this wasn't all just hype and talk. One of Ashurbanipal's most important and lasting achievements was to create a great library, unlike the world had ever known before him. He created this royal library at Nineveh, and it was his attempt to assemble all of the written knowledge in Mesopotamia in one place. And at its height, it included over 100,000 texts, written on everything from astrological interpretations to rituals, literary texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the artifacts found here today make up a huge part of what we know about ancient Mesopotamia. Additionally, he put a big importance on art, and he had these huge stone carvings called bas-reliefs built to line the walls of his palaces. These reliefs are some of the most intricate works of art from the ancient Near East. The most famous depicts Ashurbanipal in a lion hunt, which was important to the Assyrian people who apparently had to contend with actual lion hunts in the Middle East at that time, and it meant that the king was capable of defending them from the outside world. And another one of Ashurbanipal's reliefs shows him and his wife, Labali Sharat, enjoying dinner together in a garden. It's called the Garden Party Relief. And it's the only image from ancient Assyria depicting a person other than the king, yet alone a woman, holding court. And at odds with what I'm going to tell you next about Ashurbanipal, it shows the man in kind of a sweet light. So, hold all of these accomplishments and ideals in your mind on one side of the ledger when it comes to the life and rule of Ashurbanipal. And on the other are some objectively fucked up things which he did, which I'll go over next. Ashurbanipal spent the early part of his reign putting down rebellions in Egypt, which his father had conquered. And he did all the predictable things that come with squashing a rebellion. Looting, selling people into slavery, impalement, all the fan favorites. Later in his reign, though, on the other side of the empire, in 653, a group that had bothered the Assyrians for centuries was causing a much more imminent problem. These were the Elamites, and their king, named Tumen, made a secret pact with Ashurbanipal's brother, Shamash-shum-ukin, from before, who apparently didn't like playing second fiddle to his younger brother. After making this deal, Tumen launched a surprise attack on the Assyrians. But before they could make much headway, Tumen and his army were cut off and thwarted by Ashurbanipal at the Ule River in modern western Iran. Ashurbanipal destroyed the Elamite army, and he actually brought Tumen's decapitated head back to Nineveh, where it was displayed in victory parades. And while we're on the subject of Tumen's head, in that garden party relief I was telling you about a second ago, which depicts Ashurbanipal and his wife enjoying a nice meal in a royal garden, it also features Tumen's head hanging from a tree in the background. So the sweetness of that moment looks a little more sour with that detail added to this work. After Tumen's defeat, Shamash-shum-ukin gathered the remnants of the Elamite forces, as well as the support of other people in the area, like the Persians and the Cimmerians, who all wished to see Ashurbanipal and the Assyrians eliminated, and would go on a bloody campaign. Over the next few years, Shamash-shum-ukin and the others would fight with the Assyrians and Ashurbanipal, but it became pretty clear within the first couple years of the war that things were going to go the Assyrians' way. So in 650, a sister of the two brothers named Sheru-Itrite tried to talk to Shamash-shum-ukin into submitting to Ashurbanipal and asking for mercy. Her appeals for peace were ignored, and Ashurbanipal moved his army to surround Babylon for a lengthy siege. Ashurbanipal did not take it easy on his brother, and the siege would last 2 years and bring enormous suffering to the inhabitants. Ashurbanipal himself, in kind of a bragging way, described the carnage he inflicted on the people of Babylon, writing, "They ate dogs and mongooses. Their sin was great. They gnawed on the hides of animals, leather straps, shoes, and sandals. Instead of bread, they ate the flesh of their sons. Instead of beer, they drank the blood of their daughters. They became like corpses. The faces of the people darkened as if by smoke with depression and mourning. In the city squares, the young man saw the woman naked, and the young woman the young man. Plague and illness reduced the people. A deadly hush had been poured out. The people's storerooms were laid waste, their fields wept and mourned, and their watercourse, which had once gushed with abundance of water, was now filled with silt." Shamash-shum-ukin did not escape the wrath, and he perished in the flames of his palace. Ashurbanipal then installed a puppet king named Kandalunu as the new king of Babylon. Even after this decimation of Babylon, Ashurbanipal was not satisfied, and in 646, he had his army march on the Elamites at their capital in Susa, and he had laid waste to that ancient city as well. Royal captives from a war like this were often brought back to Nineveh and forced to endure some humiliating tortures, as did the new Elamite king named Uman-al-Dashu, who after the destruction of Susa was, quote, stripped of his power, ending his days as a captive in Nineveh, where he had to serve the Assyrian king food and during religious festivals pull his chariot like a horse. And what will be an important piece of information of what happens after Ashurbanipal's death, with the Elamites gone, a power vacuum in the region developed, which was to be filled by an even more fearsome group called the Medes. Weirdly, towards the end of his life, Ashurbanipal seems to have kind of just faded away, and little is known about the late stage of his reign. He was perhaps ailing from the same mental turmoil as his father, and in one of his last known inscriptions, he himself wrote, quote, "I cannot do away with the strife in my country and the dissensions in my family. Disturbing scandals oppress me always. Illness of mind and flesh bow me down. With cries of woe, I bring my days to an end. On the city of God, the day of the festival, I am wretched. Death is seizing upon me and bears me down." In 631, Ashurbanipal died at 54 years old, probably of natural causes. But his death led to a power struggle between his sons for the throne, and it kind of set the stage for the apocalypse of the Assyrian Empire. Before we get there, though, looking back at Ashurbanipal as a whole. On the one hand, we have a literate king who was into art and math. And on the other hand, we have a brutal psychopath. Overall, the reality of Ashurbanipal's term is summed up well by the historian Eckhart Fromm. Ashurbanipal was a poor military leader, an overrated hunter, and a mediocre scholar. With his sadistic propensities, he resembled more a Nero than a philosopher emperor like Marcus Aurelius or Akbar. End quote. A few decades after his death, by 620, recognizing the fragility of the Assyrian Empire, all these groups that the Assyrians had bullied for centuries came together to try to eliminate the Assyrians again. For the next few years, they systematically wiped out the smaller cities of the empire and worked their way up to Nineveh. And by 612, the coalition army surrounded the legendarily formidable walls of Nineveh, which were perhaps the biggest in the world at that time. And unlike the slow decline of the Roman Empire, the Assyrians went out in a flash, and their walls were breached and their people were annihilated. In under half a century, the Assyrians went from being the most powerful force in history to that point, to a forgotten group with their cities turned into ghost towns. So complete was the destruction at Nineveh that hundreds of years later, in 401 BC, a Greek mercenary and author named Xenophon happened upon the ruins of the city. At the time, he was leading a group of Greek mercenaries through the Middle East on their way back home, and they stumbled upon these gigantic walls and unoccupied ruins of a massive city. Apparently, small groups of people were living amongst the ruins and kind of passing through this formerly thriving place, and Xenophon asked them who had built this impressive city and what had happened. The locals had no idea, or they said that the Medes had built them. They had never even heard of the Assyrians, and Xenophon camped in this ghost town and brought the tale back home, completely unaware of the once great empire he was passing through. Imagine walking through the desert and coming across walls 100 feet high and 50 feet thick, with scattered ruins and no one around. It feels so spooky and alien and mysterious in a way that only the ancient world can. And that'll do it. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.